Hello and welcome to this session hosted by London CND on climate, care and nukes. My name's Tom Terrainer, and amongst other things, I'm one of the vice chairs of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, commonly known as CND. CND was established in 1957, so long before any of us on this chat were around, and we were established specifically to campaign for the abolition of all nuclear weapons, first in the UK, but also internationally. So we're part of a global movement, and we're very, very proud of that. And this movement recognises the enormous dangers posed by nuclear weapons, wherever they are, whoever has them. And to be clear, the nuclear armed states combined have enough nuclear weapons to wipe out all life on this planet. There are now more nuclear warheads, more of that power around than there has ever been. And more money is being invested and spent on producing ever more deadly, ever more vicious weapons. So that's worrying enough. But when you look at the people who control this terrifying power, and I don't think I need to name Donald Trump and Boris Johnson specifically, but I just have done, then it's clear what's at stake. This is why the recent announcement over the weekend that the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has reached 50 ratifications and will come into force, as it's termed, on the 22nd of January next year. This is a vitally important step for the disarmament movement and indeed for all of us. It's a massive step forward for nuclear disarmament. But the government of the UK, along with its allies in NATO and in the US, will do everything it can, not just to ignore this treaty, but to undermine it. That process is already underway, with Donald Trump contacting people who've already signed and ratified this treaty, telling them they need to rescind or take away their support. So when faced with this, faced with an international call that says we need to scrap these weapons of murder, and faced with our own government saying we're going to ignore it or do our best to undermine it, this is where a campaign like CND comes in. And if you're not already a member, then you certainly should join us as soon as possible. So rather than take a step forward for peace, instead of going towards peace, the UK government is committed to spending more than 200 billion on replacing and updating its ability to murder millions of people at the push of a button. More than 200 billion for murder. What else could this money have been spent on? What useful rather than murderous purpose could this money have been mobilised for? There are three massive problems facing all of us: the increasing threat of war and the increasing tensions, the need to respond effectively to the pandemic and care more generally, and the looming and ever-intensifying climate catastrophe. The UK government chose to spend more than £200 billion on new nukes, and in so doing, increasing the risks and threats that we all face. At the same time, there's little evidence, to no evidence, that enough has been done to prepare for the pandemic, for instance, or to seriously address climate change. And this is despite the fact that in their own assessment of the risks that we all face, the UK government put the threat of a global pandemic and the threat posed by climate change as a greater security risk than, for instance, the risk that some state somewhere with a nuclear missile would fire it at the UK. They knew that these risks were greater, but they chose instead to spend 200 billion or more on weapons of murder. Why is that? Why the wrong priorities? What are the links? And what are we going to do about it? This is what we're here to discuss, think about, and plan actions on. And to help us do that, we've got a number of incredible speakers lined up. First, we're going to hear from Jinsella, and she's one of the co-founders of De-Militarise Education. She's a community organiser and host who became a peace activist after discovering that London hosts one of the world's biggest arms fairs during her year in industry as part of her fashion marketing degree. And if you haven't tuned into the education stuff online, please do so. It's excellent. So I'm going to hand over to Jinsella.
Hi everybody, it's great to be here, and you know, even when it comes to Black Lives Matter, health and the pandemic, climate change and nuclear disarmament, it's just amazing to see so much more effort going into intersectionality and just collaboration. So thank you for having me. So yeah, basically DED, which is short for Demilitarise Education, was set up because we were just blown away by the fact that our universities were so deeply involved in the arms trade. This means by financial investments, student research, and also career funneling students into arms companies. And with it being such a profitable industry, there's a lot of perks and benefits that goes with these ties. So we find it just shocking that students are kind of put to this unethical and biased opportunity. So we set up Demilitarise Education so that we can build a community, make peace activism a bit more inclusive and break down issues and topics via media, and create a model for demilitarization which universities can commit to. So why demilitarize in the first place? Well, militarism is like preparing to use brute force in a way to protect national interests and influence. So as International Peace Bureau put it recently, militarism is the wrong path for the world to take. It fuels tensions and raises the potential for war and conflict. And we completely agree with this. Like, we can just look at colonial history and even just the Tory government at the moment and making a decision to not commit to nuclear disarmament like many of the other world countries are doing. It just comes from like bad decision making and putting our interest above the interest of the world first for it to go very wrong. When we're thinking about environmentalism, we're thinking about the globe and everybody involved. You know, Western and powerhouse countries, of course, are polluting the most, and it's affecting the poorest the most as well. We can see that the US military is a bigger polluter than as many as 140 countries put together, which is just crazy. And when we look at the military supply chain as well, there's vast amount of impact that comes from the production of weapons, from the sale of weapons and the transportation, from the use of weapons, and then the disposal of weapons, which most often is not done properly at all. When, you know, we're thinking about actual physical waste, chemical waste, and much more that comes with it. So Scientists for Social Responsibility and Declassified found that the carbon footprint of the British military industry was 11 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2018. And while the UK Gov is looking towards new nukes during a pandemic, we can only take this as avoidance of the realities of climate change. So now, while at DED, we haven't actually got our own research on university connections to nuclear weapons, we're more building it on arms companies. We can argue quite clearly that nuclear weapons do nothing for demilitarization and peace building processes that could help us tackle climate change. I'm just gonna say something which has really helped my personal journey of understanding the arguments behind nuclear disarmament. And then I'm just gonna fire through just kind of one-word statements, which I hope will guide your discussions and perhaps actions. So first of all, understanding mutually assured destruction. So this is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which a full-scale use of nuclear by two or more opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. This is not a defence policy, but rather a wasteful show of power. That last bit was me talking, not the quote of what it actually is, just to be clear. So yeah, and I think once I learned about that and I was like, okay, so mutually assured destruction is our nuclear policy, it kind of really helped me harness my argument around what you may come across when discussing this, which is like nuclear weapons actually keep us safe because it deters people from wanting to attack us. But actually, the cost of war, particularly today when it's, our military industries are so vast and so advanced that the cost of war is already so high without nuclear weapons. We have to really rethink about our security as a whole. We could prepare for international threat in a much more constructive way that costs less, creates more jobs in security, and helps tackle climate change, health crisis, without the risk of accidental nuclear war that doesn't just kill our enemy, but also kills ourselves. And then, of course, it could trigger a nuclear winter. What I will just finish on is the what, why, who, and how, and when. So what? We want welfare, not warfare. Why? Climate change triggers tensions, and using nukes would cause even more climate change, or worse, nuclear winter. Who? The UK needs to act. The UK needs to follow the rest of the world's example and take this moment to work towards strategic and intelligence-led peace building rather than peace building by force. How? There's so many amazing groups like Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, like us at DED, Stop the War, Extinction, Rebellion, that are really set up with the resources and the support system you need to start your journey of learning and acting. So get involved, look what's around and act if you can. When? Now. The risk of climate change is fast approaching us, and I strongly argue that we look to move our finances that go into nukes, which is over 206 billion, and the nukes only have a 30-year lifespan, into tackling the next 12 years, which will seriously shape our future.
Thanks for that, Jensela, and thanks for bringing up mutually assured destruction, or somebody in the chat has rechristened it mutual genocidal suicide pact. That's still a big picture in terms of nuclear policy, but it's worthwhile knowing also that the British government doesn't explicitly tell people under what circumstances it would use nuclear weapons. So for a long time, it was thought that we had a no first strike policy. So the UK, being the good guys, would never use their nuclear weapons first. That's not the case anymore. That is not the case anymore. So just to throw that in there. Our next speaker is Maya Wakefield from the Stop the War Coalition. CND is very proud to be part of that coalition. And we're extremely proud of the work that we've done together along with Stop the War on a whole number of issues, from the massive demonstrations in the early 2000s against the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq to all of the essential work that they've done more recently. So I think, Maya, you work in the Stop the War's office, which is an incredibly important role to fulfill, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I've been given 5 minutes to try and link care and the care crisis that we're currently going through, and militarism in general, but also Trident and nuclear disarmament more generally. I'd like to start with a memo that was leaked at the start of this pandemic, which was a Cabinet Office memo entitled the 2019 National Security Risk Assessment, which was signed off by the now famous Chief Medical Officer, Sir Patrick Vallance. In this memo, the greatest potential threat to the country was, of course, an influenza-type pandemic. This had been the same in this document through previous years, and time again, the greatest potential threat to the country was identified as an influenza-type pandemic. The document then goes on to list a very similar scenario to the one we're now witnessing in great detail. It talks about multiple waves of the pandemic, a huge economic impact, how long it may take to get a vaccine, etc. Unfortunately, as we know, these warnings were largely unheeded, and there was a real failure to prepare. Recommendations for stockpiling of PPE and plans for a contact tracing system were largely ignored until the pandemic began to take hold, and well, even later, as we also now know. Meanwhile, as we also know, the 10 years of Tory austerity that had come before it really eroded the public services that we needed in order to deal with a pandemic of this time. This was particularly, is particularly the case for a number of public health bodies, and particularly the Public Health Grant, which is the grant which enables our local authorities and councils to deliver the vital services needed to prevent such pandemics or viruses really taking hold in the population. Since 2015, the public health grant had been cut by almost £850 million. And key bodies like the King's Fund and the Health Foundation were calling for a £1 billion increase in the public health budget. It may sound like a lot, and well, unfortunately for Rishi Sunak in his first budget in March of this year, it was, because they only gave 145 million increase, less than 15% of what was asked for by these major health charities. So rather than the 1 billion that was needed in order to shore up our public health services, instead he gave 145 million. Now, this is clearly a simple question of priorities. Rather than fund our public health services, which we're now also so reliant upon, instead money was guaranteed for the military, and of course, as we know, £205 billion worth of funding for the Trident nuclear weapon system. Now, this weapon system has been described as a monster by the former chief civil servant at the Ministry of Defence, and it is clearly a huge drain on our public resources. And the question then must be asked, why? Well, it's primarily down to pride. The British establishment and successive governments seem to be obsessed with the idea of Britain being a top-tier military power. This is an outdated imperial obsession which is leading to clear failures of governance and therefore underfunding of things like our public health systems. Quite frankly, it does endanger the lives of us all. And I think in the wake of the pandemic, or even during it as we now are, there is an increasing appetite from the public to discuss such absurd military spending. Even yesterday I was listening to a radio debate on Radio 5 Live for my sins. I don't know why I was doing that, but I was. And the presenter then, quite out of the blue, said, well, what about Trident? Why are we spending so much on Trident? And it really took me by surprise, because I hadn't heard certainly a BBC presenter say anything like that for a long period of time. And it made me think that maybe these conversations are beginning to open up. There is a debate around military spending, and particularly Trident, with that huge, the colossal amount of money that is going into it. That debate is maybe, hopefully, starting to open up, and we, as an anti-war movement, need to take advantage of that, and students are a key part of that. And we hope that you can get involved and become part of it and really challenge the military establishment, which unfortunately does have a big hold on our country at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya. So, food for thought, lots of things to think about, but this whole session is a bit different because we're moving into the second part, which is more participatory. We want those of you online to get involved, to share your thoughts on everything you've discussed, but actually, importantly as well, about your thoughts on what actions, what activity we can take, how can we address these issues. And to help us